Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargava, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. Most of us have grown up reading stories about India's freedom struggle. The revolt of 1857, often called the First War of Independence, the non-cooperation movement and the mass boycotts of British institutions, the Chauri Chaura incident, the Salt March, the Quit India movement. It's like flipping through the pages of our school history textbooks. The image of freedom fighters and Congress leaders raising their voices against British rule is deeply familiar. But today, on India's 79th Independence Day, we want to share stories that don't usually get the spotlight. Stories that show that the vision for a new India was far from homogeneous, that there were deep divisions within the region even before independence, and that 1947 did not mean freedom for every region of the subcontinent. But we begin the show by stepping away from India altogether, to Britain, the homeland of our colonizers, which in the early 1800s had a sizable Indian population of its own.
I think we've always associated elite personalities with being in the UK, but some of the earliest Indians to actually arrive in large numbers would be the 1820s, and these were a group of domestic servants, actually ayahs.
That's the Indian Express's Nikita Mohta.
So, female domestic servants, who also known as ayahs, who were employed in Anglo-Indian households across UK, particularly urban areas such as London. And research shows that by 1825, it was almost natural to see an Indian ayah in these houses.
She says that this was the time when the British Parliament formally embraced the principles of free trade capitalism. The repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846 signaled a shift away from protectionism toward a more liberal economic policy. Now, this in turn brought a lot more ships into Britain, and with them, a much larger number of Indian seamen.
So these were the next largest community in the UK, which was the Lascars or sailors. And these sailors were in huge numbers present in London. And I think one reason why the British wanted to hold on to these Indian sailors was because their pay was about 10 times lesser to that of a British seaman. So they were obviously very cheap labor. They were stranded in a foreign land. So these were essentially two of the biggest communities.
But later, in the last decade of the 19th century, Indian students also began arriving in Britain. By the 1890s, there were around 200 of them. And over the next 20 years, that number slowly grew to around 700.
However, by the 1930s, I think research has shown and scholars have pointed out that Indians constituted about 87% of colonial students in Britain. That was a very, very big number. So clearly, Indians were attracted to education prospects in the UK and they formed this significant community in Britain.
Among them were barristers like Gyanendra Mohan Tagore, Michael Madhusudan Dutt, and Womesh Chandra Banerjee.
Besides that, there was Kursetji Manikji Shroff from Bombay, who was the first Indian to pursue his undergraduate studies at Oxford University. Of course, we must mention Sarojini Naidu, who between 1895 and 1898 was pursuing her undergraduate studies at King's College. There was Cornelia Sorabji, who had left Pune and moved to Oxford again to study law. And obviously, they were all trailblazers at the time, yeah.
And now their arrival in Britain completely changed the conversations within the diaspora. It was this group of young Indians who began speaking out against the British rule in India.
So with the arrival of these extremely aspirational, ambitious, educated students, most of whom were coming to UK's topmost universities, which was Oxford, which was Cambridge, which was LSE, which was King's. And so I think one thing that really changed was debate and discussion. I think most of these students were also pursuing extremely like subjects which were socio-political in nature, right? So they were all participating in these debating societies. And I must mention that around the 1890s, Oxford and Cambridge had sort of formulated something called the Majlis circles. Now, these Majlis circles were basically debating societies that were created by and constituted for the South Asian community. And these South Asian students would then sort of pick out topics such as British imperialism, they would pick out electoral equality. And you see, these debating circles became the space where these students, many of whom came from decently humble backgrounds, were then exposed to Indian nationalists. So, there's a Lala Lajpat Rai who's coming to Oxford to deliver a lecture. Swami Vivekananda happened to be in London for 3 months around the 1890s. So he was also invited very frequently by Oxford to deliver lectures. So not only were these students sort of discussing and speaking politics, but they were also meeting personalities, and these were young, impressionable minds which had now started thinking about India and the cause for the freedom struggle. And so all of this was sort of happening in the backdrop.
Nikita says that these students soon turned to the written word, publishing leaflets, pamphlets, and magazines that addressed issues of colonial rule back home.
I must mention an Indian writer in London called Mulk Raj Anand, for instance. He ended up forming something called the All India Progressive Writers Association. And, he gathered like-minded Indian students and they drafted the manifesto of this association. And the idea basically was they would now use the written word to address issues that were impacting India, issues right from poverty, illiteracy, gender inequality, including caste. So they had also started discussing caste at the time, and all of this was happening in disguise. So it's not like the Writers Association was out there, in public. This was disguised as a restaurant somewhere in Chinatown. And so there was a lot that they were doing, not just in the form of writing, but also protecting these efforts to make sure that it kind of reaches a certain destination.
Now, around this time, one place that became central to the Indian diaspora and their cause was a place called the India House.
So the India House is extremely interesting because honestly, it's very sort of overlooked in mainstream literature, right? It was formed by this gentleman called Shyamji Krishnavarma, who was born in the historic year 1857 in Gujarat. And he sort of moved to London as an assistant to a Sanskrit professor in Oxford. So again, kind of circling back to the point that most of these Indians who were arriving were then associated with these very elite universities. And it's said that, around early 1905, he sort of rented this huge Victorian mansion and he paid about £7,600 at the time to create what we know as the India House. And this was located in Highgate in North London. And they describe it as this huge building located near the cemetery where Karl Marx was buried. And clearly, if you think about £7,600, that's a lot of money for back then.
And she says that Krishnavarma's vision was clear. He wanted India House to draw students to the cause of the Indian freedom movement.
And this was primarily because he thought that it was only a group of well-educated Indians, Indians or graduates of Western educational institutions to be specific, who could sort of really fight for Indian independence or even understand the cause. And interestingly, India House was only open to Indians when it sort of came up. The institution went on to kind of give stipends to students to pursue education. It also gave free accommodation and food to about 20-25 students in the beginning. So, it was a very specific institution catering to a very specific category of abroad educated students.
Now, just like the Indian students mentioned earlier, Krishnavarma understood the power of the written word. And so he launched pamphlets and journals, including one called The Indian Sociologist.
And thousands of copies of Indian Sociologists was actually distributed. And these weren't just circulated in London, but they were sent abroad. And they say to virtually every place, whether you're looking at South Africa, whether you're looking at California, Mauritius, Hong Kong. So, this is again the early 20th century where this gentleman has managed to put together sum of money, open this house, attract students, and then his pamphlets are being circulated worldwide, right? So I think that is an achievement in itself. And this was not an achievement that the government wasn't taking note of, right? Because the Indian sociologist, interestingly, 2.5 years after he had started writing it, was actually banned. It was prohibited by the government of India because the government of India thought that the journal was encouraging terrorist violence. So clearly it was sort of creating some kind of havoc, right? The India House was also visited by many Indian nationalists, whether that was Gandhi, whether that was Lala Lajpat Rai. So, it was becoming an institution of eminence. And I think as far as the organizations that emerged from the India House, there was, of course, the India Home Rule Society, which was the primary organization that branched out. Additionally, Vinayak Damodar Savarkar also established the Abhinav Bharati Society. It was a secret radical society which was within the India House again. And the Paris Indian Society, also a branch of the India Home Rule Society, was launched with Bhikaji Kama's support in the same institution.
Slowly, more students and activists began joining this movement, and among them was Shapurji Saklatwala, a member of the Independent Labour Party who also supported the female suffragette movement of the time.
He was also fighting for affordable housing. He was also fighting for the rights of sailors, the Laskar rights, so to say. But what's also very interesting is he was extremely drawn to Lenin's communism. And so there was this one meeting where he ended up saying that, the only way for India to gain independence is to kill the British. And he also almost recommended that the water to kind of poison the Bombay water supplies so that in order to kill the British troops. So there were multiple sides to this gentleman, right from being a so-called early feminist to sort of being an extremist and suggesting mass killings, so to say.
And besides him, there were also people like V.K. Krishna Menon, who had been involved with Annie Besant's Home Rule for India League, which later came to be known as just the India League.
Over the decade, the India League happened to spread across the UK to present-day Scotland. So it had offices in Edinburgh, Glasgow, Coventry, Wales. It also had offices in America, interestingly. And again, these offices were attended by Indian students, by trade unionists, by cooperative societies. And, all of these offices in their own capacity advocated for gender equality, liberty. They discussed British imperialism. And in fact, when in the 1940s, Nehru and other congressmen happened to be imprisoned, India League was one of the foremost institutions to sort of launch a campaign protesting these imprisonments.
Now, with all these organizations and movements emerging in Britain and back home, the British intelligence was quietly keeping an eye on them.
So if I have to explain through an example, Menon, for example, his phone was tapped. And once the British had access to his letters, they feared that he was a drug addict and a communist. So they kept tapping his phone and, to look for the opportunity to probably imprison him because they felt threatened. Likewise, Saklatwala was on the files of the criminal intelligence. This is particularly after he hosted Bipin Chandrapal at his residence in Manchester. So once this meeting that, Saklatwala has met Pal sort of came out, and once the criminal intelligence heard of this, they felt extremely threatened. So it's not like these associations that were happening with the British being unaware, or with the intelligentsia or the police not sort of trying to repress them. The Laskar, similarly, every time that community revolted, there was some kind of suppression or the other. There was police suppression. But yeah, I think one would not instantly think of phone tappings at the time. But that was one of the common ways through which the intelligence was keeping tab on these people.
Now, looking back at this period, she can't help but compare it to what was happening back in Calcutta, where students from elite colleges were also mobilizing against the Raj.
So an institution of eminence, for example, is the Hindu College in current-day College Street, right? And the Hindu College at the time is attracting these elite students, where they're being sort of exposed to ideas of the freedom struggle. And then these students then sort of, again, some of them rise in arms like Saklatwala, and they say that, we have to sort of take the extremist way and kill the British. There are others who are doing it through debate, who are doing it through the written word and kind of adopting more moderate terms. And they're doing it in very similar ways. So whether they take up a section of the coffee house, which from the outside looks like a common eatery for students, but they've sort of made that a den. Whether they sort of take up this sharbat shop round the corner in College Street, which again looks like it's just sort of making juices and, sharbats. But internally, there's this one corner room which is built up as this revolutionary den. They took up doctors' clinics, for instance, across current day Park Circus. They took up the laboratories of chemists, which looked like, this was only a lab. So I feel like this period of student activism, for the freedom struggle, young impressionable minds full of ambition and what they were doing parallelly in Calcutta, I find that very fascinating.
Now we know that these young students and other freedom fighters all hope to live in a world free from British oppression, a country where politics reflected their ideas and values. But turns out not everyone agreed on what that vision should be, or on what the country and its politics should look like. In fact, this was a point of contention between several prominent leaders from the Congress Party and leaders from the oppressed castes. And when we spoke to Professor Arup Chatterjee, he explained that this is why figures like Jyotiba Phule, the 19th century Marathi activist and one of modern India's first anti-caste ideologues, often found allies not in leaders like Gandhi, but in Christian missionaries, for example.
So, Jyotiba Phule is a merchant, so he's economically not really marginal in his independent capacity, but he comes from a community which he certainly sees as politically marginalized, and he certainly sees his community as being a victim of deep Brahminical oppression. So he finds supporters in the past of the Mughals, he finds allies in Mughal history, and he sees the Christian missionaries as his allies, right? So his allies are not Gandhi, who is, about to go to London in 10 or 15 years from now and become a lawyer. His allies are certainly not Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who will also be studying for law around the same time.
What Phule in works like Gulamgiri was trying to highlight was the plight of the untouchables, putting into words a long history of violence and subjugation by the privileged castes. Phule, of course, would go on to inspire many people, including Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who Chatterjee says openly allied with non-Brahmin movements. In fact, as the nationalist movement grew in the country, people like Ambedkar were also championing the cause for what were then called the depressed classes. In 1927, for example, Ambedkar had led the Mahat Satyagraha to demand the right for untouchables to draw water from a public tank in Mahad in Maharashtra, a tank that had been sealed off to them by upper caste leaders. Now, Chatterjee says that at least initially, the Congress party was not that agitated on the question of caste.
At least not agitated enough in the eyes of Dr. Ambedkar. So Dr. Ambedkar gets together with Rao Bahadur MC Raja, who's a Tamil politician, and they set up the All India Depressed Classes Association, and they meet for the first conference in Nagpur in 1926. And this is just 1 year before the Mahar Satyagraha. And when MC Raja and Dr. Ambedkar have a kind of a, let's say, cooling off of relations in early 1930s, Dr. Ambedkar himself starts organizing new parties. So he sets up the All India Depressed Classes Congress. And the Congress sets up the All India Depressed Classes League. Later on in 1936, Dr. Ambedkar would set up the All India Depressed Classes Federation. So there are many such bodies that the Ambedkarite side and the Congress side and several other independent sides would put up with the phrase All India Depressed Classes.
Now the tensions between Ambedkarites and Congress leaders came to a head around 1930. This was during the series of 3 roundtable conferences organized by the British government to discuss constitutional reforms.
So after the second roundtable conference, it is now common knowledge that Ramsay MacDonald, the Prime Minister of Britain, wants separate electorates for Hindus, Muslims, Christians, and he wants separate electorates for the depressed classes.
Now, a separate electorate works by allowing a specific community to elect its own representatives in an election, where only members of that community can vote, and candidates are also limited to that community.
So this is hugely problematic to the ears of Gandhi and the Congress, because when you dehyphenate Hindus and depressed classes, especially in 1930s, that's like a partition of India before the partition of India, in the politics, in the ideology that Gandhi and the Congress believe in.
Now later, he says, as a partial resolution of their differences, Gandhi and Ambedkar signed the historic Pune Pact in September 1932.
And many historians still refer to the Pune Pact as this, great. On the one hand, there's talk of this being a great betrayal towards Dr. Ambedkar. On the other hand, there's consensus that the Pune Pact saved India, because during the Pune Pact, 1932, Gandhiji was at the Yarwada Central Jail, and he went on a fast unto death, and he convinced Dr. Ambedkar to forego, to do a rollback on the separate electorates, and he promised reserved seats for the depressed classes to Dr. Ambedkar. So this would be done through an electoral college, and a certain community in a certain geography would get together and they would nominate up 3 to 4 members, and one of those members would be sent to that constituency and so on. So this internal mechanism was worked out. The real problem was that Dr. Ambedkar felt that he was having to cave in because of the emotions, of the crowd. So Gandhiji should not have gone on a fast unto death.
Later, the divide between Ambedkar and the Congress party grew further when the party appointed the Dalit leader Babu Jagjeevan Ram as the president of its All India Depressed Classes League.
So the Congress, since the second round table, has started promoting Babu Jagjeevan Ram. So Ambedkar feels betrayed by, all these occurrences. So it seems as if by the 40s, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, otherwise a towering personality, otherwise, a mammoth thinker, and really the person who gives agency and currency to Dalitness as a political category of thinking about India, I think he's also, in practical terms, feeling a little bit left alone. I know I make that sound pretty casual, but a man of his stature, I don't think has as many followers as he deserves in the 1940s.
Now, during this time, the British exploited this issue and used existing caste hierarchies to their advantage. One example of this was the Criminal Tribes Act of 1871.
What does this act do, Criminal Tribes Act? In that entire communities began being labeled as criminals, right? And in Bengal, where forensic sciences were being modernized, being revolutionized, on the one hand, there's the gift of imperial science and empiricism, British empiricism, but on the other hand, there are lethal interpretations of this science into a eugenics of sorts. So people's facial angles, their the anatomy of the face is being used to judge whether they predict whether they have any kind of criminal tendencies in their DNA and so forth. So all this becomes part of criminal tribes, and the British are trying to play divide and rule in various ways at this time. So they have already tried it with communal politics during and before the mutiny, the Great War of Independence, and now they are trying it with caste.
Now, while discussing this issue, it is important to highlight that Dalit politics, for instance, at an all-India level was very diverse and never became a single, uniform movement.
I mean, I don't know how people at large would feel, but the Ambedkarite movement feels shocked to hear or see that in the late 1930s, there was Indian social solidarity, which was being celebrated during Ram Leela performances. So the Ramayana, which is also seen as a text of certain kinds of inequities, despite the everlasting glory of that text, that was being celebrated by people of all castes, classes, and character during the independence movement. So this was a victory of the Gandhian movement against the Ambedkarite movement, because surely not Periyar, but even not Ambedkar would have enjoyed very much Ramayana performances being, celebrated by people of all castes in India. So the political identity of the Dalit movement and the caste emancipation movement in India in 1940s became very heterogeneous. There were peasant revolutions in Telangana and Bengal. There were peasant movements in Punjab, Maharashtra. There were agrarian movements being fought or mobilized in the diaspora in London, in Germany, under names of, agrarian banners, obviously. They were fighting on behalf of Indian farmers. So all these, subaltern movements consumed the energy that had been built until, let's say, the late 1930s with the help of all those all India depressed classes, league, federation, associations, and so on. And this heterogeneity, in fact, gets consolidated by the Constitution and the Republic of India. So I'm using these words to mean something benign. What I'm trying to say is that this heterogeneity was in service of a certain unity because India needed unity at every cost. So for national integration, the harmony between castes was indispensable.
The way these issues were tackled and the compromises made in the lead up to 1947 continue to have effects even today.
So I would refer to the works of three key authors. One is, the very, very, very well-known Arundhati Roy, who has rhetorically stated that Dalitness is not the way to peace in India, and she means this sarcastically, of course, that any kind of Dalit aspiration is a breach of peace, because peace has to be maintained through dogmatic structures, and these structures, according to Arundhati Roy, are Brahminical. On a more, let's say, down-to-earth, literal sense, there are two social thinkers that I turn to. One is Ashwani Kumar. He refers to Ambedkar as an icon of Homo equalius as opposed to Homo hierarchicus. And why he does that is because he sees in Gandhi an amazing force to emancipate India's caste challenges, but at the same time, Ashwani Kumar identifies in Gandhi a strong Vaishnavite force. And that Vaishnavite force or that Vaishnavite emancipation of Dalits is not entirely Homo equalius, according to Ashwani Kumar. It has to be more constitution-based, as Ambedkar stood for. And then there is Harish Wankhede, who is a sociologist and in fact a scholar on Dalit history and Dalit sociology. So very interestingly, he's a little more frank, and he's, I think, more in line with what Arundhati Roy is also saying. Harish Wankhede believes that the kind of political, or rather the kind of sociological inequity that caste used to refer to in India has probably come down a lot. But there is political inequity, or rather caste is now becoming more of a political category than a sociological category. So what he means, or what we should understand this to mean, is we can no longer afford to look at caste purely as an identifier, as a recognition that there is something, or there used to be something high and something low. Rather, caste is now going to bring back historical memories, and those memories will have to be then healed politically. They will have to be healed constitutionally, which is why I say very interesting times lie ahead, and we need to be very, very sensitive and very holistic in our approach.
Now, after talking about the student movements in Britain and the internal strifes within the Indian region in the lead up to independence, we talk about the year 1947. It is, of course, associated with freedom and the end of colonial rule, but as many of you probably know, this wasn't the case with every region in the subcontinent. Because apart from the British, several areas were under the French and Portuguese rule, and they remained so even after the British left.
And both these powers didn't really have a lot of territory in India. They had little pockets.
That's the Indian Express's Adrija Roy Choudhury.
Like the Portuguese colonies were Daman, Diu, Goa, Nagar Haveli, Panikota. And then there were the French colonies, Pondicherry, Mahe, Chandarnagar, Karaikal, Yangon. So these were, very small territories which were there under these European rule, and they remained so for at least another decade or so, a little more than a decade actually, after the British left.
And she says that what's interesting is how the experiences of colonialism in these two regions were starkly different from each other.
So in the French colonies, for instance, there was also this idea that the French are the good colonizers, quote unquote. Okay, so they are the people who are liberal, who are not like the tyrannical Brits. Whereas in the Portuguese territories, it's completely diametrically opposite. Like in the Portuguese territories, this idea was that these are very, very tyrannical rulers, draconian, racist, all of that. And again, you see the anti-colonial movement also play out very differently in both these cases. So in the Portuguese colonies, in Goa, for instance, you have a nationalist movement that can be traced back to, say, the 1700s. And there's something or the other happening. So, the anti-colonial struggle is a lot more very well formed in the Portuguese colonies. On the other hand, in the French colonies, you actually had, a lot of people were in dilemma as to whether they should join India after the British have left, whether it's a good idea to join India or whether we should still stay on with the French. So that by itself shows that, how both these places were associating with the British rule and with the new form Indian government.
Now, after 1947, the Indian government under Nehru was very clear that both the French and Portuguese territories had to cede to India, especially since many of these pockets had been surrounded by British Indian territories.
And in case of Goa, Nehru has famously called it a pimple on the face of India, that, you cannot have something just sticking out that way when the rest of the subcontinent is now free of European rule. These pockets also need to be ceded to the Indian government. That was very clear. But in case of the Portuguese territories, there was a lot of back and forth. In the case of French territories, there was a mutual agreement that France and India come to with time in early 1950s. In case of the Portuguese territories, there was also this fear that, already there is a partition that's going on and we don't want to get into another nasty negotiation with a foreign power. This is also post-World War II, remember. So Portugal is part of NATO, and by extension, Goa becomes part of NATO as well. And the Indian government is very cautious that they don't want to disturb this foreign policy equation over here, and they don't really want to mess with NATO.
In fact, she points out that in 1955, during his Independence Day speech, Nehru was actually quite critical of the Satyagraha movement in Goa.
Whereas he himself, a few years back, was very clear on the fact that Goa has to become a part of India. He then suddenly flips and is very critical of the nationalist uprising happening over there. So there was a bit of a confusion among the nationalist leaders about the position of the Portuguese territories. Well, the French territories, because at the end of the World War, even the French were also rethinking about their own position in the global order of things and how to really consolidate their empire in this post-World War world. So there was, at some level, the two governments could work with each other. But things were not that easy when it came to the Portuguese territories.
Now, when it comes to the French colonies, in Chandanagar, which is now part of West Bengal, there was a referendum in 1948 in which a large majority voted to join India. But in other French territories, things were a bit more complicated.
There was anxiety about, whether this Hindi-speaking government in the north, they will overpower the identity of these people. There was also this discomfort about the fact that France is economically a lot more well-off than what India is. So whether it makes sense economically also to be a part of the independent India. And we also see that there's a lot of violent encounters that happens, in these areas that are on the borders of the French and the British territories. And it gets very tricky, chaotic. There's a lot of bloodshed happening. And the French also realize that, things are not very great in this entire space right now. Finally, in 1954, the French also are defeated in Indochina, and then they realize that it's better to just step out of this region. So in case of the colonies other than Chandanagar, they drop the idea of a referendum altogether. And 54, they sign this. There's a meeting that happens in Pondicherry, and finally it's agreed that the French territories will formally merge with India.
But even then, she says for about 8 years, the treaty remained unratified, leaving people in places like Pondicherry in a state of limbo.
So people are just, confused about what their status is. It's only in 1962, 8 years after they had formally decided about the merger, that it finally comes into effect. And then also the French government actually gives around 6 months for the people of these territories to choose whether they want to be a part of France. You can choose to have French citizenship. So a lot of them did choose French citizenship after 62 when the 6 months window was given. A lot of others were not even very aware of, the fact that the French government has made a provision like this. So there was a bit of ignorance as well. And one of the authors I spoke to, Ari Gautier, he had told me this, that years later, there was also a bit of regret among people who did not get the French citizenship, because perhaps, economically it might have made sense to them at the moment, but there was also not enough information doing the rounds at that moment.
Now, when it came to the Portuguese colonies, things were far less straightforward. And in fact, its first nationalist campaign, the Pinto Rebellion, took place in 1787.
So it's that long back, and it was supposedly inspired by the French Revolution. So you can almost say that over centuries, by the time you have a nationalist uprising, even starting out in India, you already have a culture of anti-colonial struggle in Goa. If you think about it, 1787 is even much before the 1857 uprising in India. So there's literally a legacy of anti-colonial movement that has been carried on. And another very big difference between the French and Portuguese territories over here is that, Goa was always part of Portugal. So you had representatives from Goa being part of the Portuguese parliament since 19th century. So one of the most renowned Goan nationalist leader was this person called Francisco Luis Gomes, and he represented Goa. And he was also a, very ferocious anti-colonialist. He was very proud of his Indian heritage, of his Indianness. And he would keep bringing this up as well, that it was against the racist policies of the Portuguese government. Also, at this moment, Portugal is by itself also being ruled by a dictator. All right, so that also is very different from the way things are in France. So Portugal right now is under the rule of Salazar, and he is well known to be a dictator. And during the Indian independence movement also, he had maintained very clearly that Goa is an integral part of Portugal. And you see that, the way the Portuguese are also looking at their territories in India is very different from the way the French are.
She says it was eventually in 1946 that the National Congress of Goa was formed, modelled along the lines of the Indian National Congress.
But between 47 and 53, there are several efforts being made by both the Indian government and the nationalist leaders over here for it to be a diplomatic transfer of power. But eventually that really doesn't lead to any results. And, in 54, you have this mass satyagraha happening organized by the National Congress in Goa. And it was that time brutally suppressed by the Portuguese authorities. And a year later, the Communist Party of India, they again sent their own satyagrahis to Goa, and, they defied all kinds of Portuguese authorities, and they raised the Indian tricolor over there. But then again, they were fired upon. So you can see that it was a very violent sort of a struggle.
This struggle continued for about 6 more years. And it was only on December 18 and 19, 1961, that a full-fledged military operation took place.
And it's called Operation Vijay, carried out by the Indian government. And finally, they are able to take over Goa. So the big difference between the two cases is that in case of France, it was mutually agreed upon. In case of the Portuguese territories, there is a military operation that has to be, take place in order to finally get rid of the Portuguese. And it's a 450-year rule that finally comes to an end in Goa.
In the end, she says what strikes her the most is how people in these colonies related to their colonizers.
On the one hand, you have the French who were seen as liberal people. I'm also guessing that, when you're surrounded by British territories, and given that France and Britain also were at loggerheads with each other, so, you also grow up with this idea that, okay, we are better off than people in British India. And the whole way in which your own identity is being developed in these pockets of India would be very different from the way perhaps when we look at our own history as post-independent citizens of India, how we look at British colonial rule. I'm not completely sure if the, people from Pondicherry have similar ways of looking at their own history. It might be very, very different.
You were listening to 3 Things by The Indian Express. Today's show was written and produced by me, Shashank Bhargava, and was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it, share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can tweet us at Express Podcasts and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.